Thanks to my patrons on Patreon, and once again to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this episode. They've really helped the channel, so check out a 30-day free trial for their documentary streaming service linked below. More on that after the episode. Hey, Cypher here. I almost skipped 6 days altogether. It seemed like just another action flick that had too little substance to even review. Then I watched it, and the pieces started falling apart under just the tiniest scrutiny. This thing was poorly put together, and the event's participants are rightly angry with the depiction. There's some decidedly Hollywood parts of this movie, and they are especially bad since this is a New Zealand film. What the heck happened here? They had such an opportunity to really get a compact film in here, but it flounders with all the callouts it wants to make to the larger story of terrorism. That's my job, not theirs, and they kinda suck at what I do. By the way, this is totally getting demonetized, so Patreon! Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a new phase of international terrorism swept the world. The 1972 Munich Olympics had publicized the problem only a few years prior, and there had been repeated incidents that were well acknowledged. Also prior, local terrorism from the IRA had swept the United Kingdom since the 1960s in a series of violent events called the Troubles. It was especially bad in Northern Ireland, where over 3,000 people eventually lost their lives over 3 decades of strife. So when Iranian terrorism swept across the world in the wake of the revolution, the UK was prepared, and they wouldn't have to wait for long. A group calling itself the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan, or DERFLA, wanted to force Iran to release several political prisoners. They ultimately wanted to create a separate republic from Khuzestan province in Iran for the Arab minority that had fallen under the oppression of the new Iranian government. During the revolution, there had been several rebellions against the Ayatollah government, including in Khuzestan. The rebellions were suppressed and their leaders imprisoned. So DERFLA wanted to free political prisoners in order to continue the fight for independence.
They have decided not to release the 91 Arabs being held in Khuzestan, the oil-producing province.
To achieve the initial goals, they attacked the Iranian embassy in 1980, taking everyone inside hostage. After 6 days of intense negotiation and the killing of a hostage, the British decided to enter by force. A platoon of SAS troops, or the British equivalent of special forces, seized the embassy. Most of the terrorists were killed in the assault, along with a hostage. Because the assault was broadcast live throughout Britain, the SAS became famous, even though they didn't really want to. After all, special forces is the silent profession. It was also fairly significant internationally given the Iranians had captured a bunch of American hostages at their embassy in Tehran, so rising terrorism was a concern. Even though it never went away in the intervening years, international concern was abated when the American hostages were returned a year later.
Day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today.
But terrorism continued to flourish to this day. The SAS has been deeply involved in anti-terrorism operations. While the world acknowledged the problem of terrorism, it would not be a leading political issue for the West until 2001, because of 9/11. Otherwise, it was seen as a problem stemming from individual issues, as in a discrete political tactic used only by extremists, rather than some worldwide intent to cause mayhem, like we think of it today. Despite the current emphasis on terrorism, there isn't actually that much material on the Iranian embassy siege. Of course, there are dozens of books on the history of terrorism, but this is just one small event among thousands. There have been a few books specifically on this event, of course. These kinds of things get a lot of coverage in popular press, mostly as first-hand accounts. But in terms of scholarly attention, not so much. And those first-hand accounts were not available at my library. Rusty Furman, the author of one such book, was brought in to advise on this film. He has written a great deal about his time in the SAS. Unfortunately, the film didn't seek any other vantage point, despite trying to speak about those other views. To take a primary source so uncritically is to bind your film to inevitable disrepute. We don't know the film's budget, but it only takes one dude with a research university's login to fix this problem. Come on, guys. The only other source that appears to have been consulted is some news footage. One of the reporters is a character, but really doesn't do anything for the plot. Ultimately, it is Furman's character who is the only thing that is fully fleshed out in this depiction, despite its flaccid attempts at others' perspectives. This movie does go out of its way to set the scene. There is more text on screen than a silent film. I tried to take notes on any info cards, but it got to the point that I was having to write down too damn much, and most of it is unnecessary information. No one cares what building you're in, movie. We don't want to hear every call out to some previous event.
It didn't work for the Germans at Munich, and this government will not copy their failed plans.
You didn't even call out the most important predecessor to this, known as the Balcom Street Siege. See, I can call out stuff without having any substance too, and that is just perturbing. So stop telling us. If the audience cares enough, they can look it up for themselves. It does indeed speak to the movie's accuracy, but that gets in the way of the viewing experience. If I wanted to read an article, I've got a lot better sources than this movie. What is nice about the accuracy of this film is how it depicts the terrorists' motives.
They demand the release of 91 Arabs held in prisons in Iran. Unless these demands are met, they will kill a hostage at noon tomorrow.
We will kill a hostage if our demands are not met. You tell your government we will kill. We want Arab ambassadors now.
In this post-9/11 age, we all too often treat terrorists as if they are all from Durkistan, without any motivations other than unadulterated hatred.
Durka, Muhammad Jihad.
And unless that's done in jest, it fuels the kind of bigotry we see on the internet with these fools conjuring up conspiracy theories of white genocide. No. When movies deal with clear enemies, it is important to refrain from demonizing them. Otherwise, you get all of these bigots like we have today. So it is done correctly here, and quite admirably. It is not so admirable for its depiction of the British. Despite this film basically being meant to glorify the SAS, it is actually terrible for that purpose. Some may call this a typical procedural with a climactic end, but that end is its entire undoing. The movie depicts the SAS coming into the building in detail, step by step. In doing so, it commits a number of inaccuracies that are defamatory to the people involved. First, the SAS are far too few in number. It only shows like 6 dudes when there were actually more than 30. I'm not one to complain about numbers of folks in a battle. Like, I get why you can't put 400,000 dudes in Dunkirk. And that even when they CGI stuff in, it's normally only like a tenth the size of the real deal. That's normal. But saying you can't get 20 or 30 extras to run about in black tactical gear is ridiculous. It also focuses on one guy as though he was the only leader in the SAS. This has made some former members of the raid express public outrage at this film. The problem with Special Forces folks getting proper representation in media is that they hardly ever write their own stories down. Historians can go check service records like after-action reviews when they get opened up, but movie producers are far too lazy to do that kind of research. So they were stuck with one guy's perspective, which is always a recipe for disaster. One thing we don't see is the heroics of Trevor Locke, who was the constable inside the embassy during the siege. They make him seem like he was not capable of defending himself, when it is exactly the opposite. He fought off terrorists during the siege, and was given a George Medal for his deeds. The citation reads, He shoulder charged the terrorist leader as the man dropped the telephone and moved towards him. The gunman was caught off balance, and his weapon fell to the floor. During the short, fierce struggle that followed, Constable Locke managed to overpower the terrorist and, for the first time, drew his own revolver and covered the man. However, an explosive device thrown into the room threw the two men apart, but the officer managed to recapture the man and hold him until the rescuers arrived and took over. That sounds like perfect film material, and it was published in the London Gazette. So the information is easily accessible, but that requires doing actual research. Finally, they show this. This doesn't even fit Rusty Furman's account. The guy hiding as a hostage was shot when they saw him pulling grenades. This makes it look like pure murder. No rules of engagement would have allowed for one of the soldiers to shoot without positive identification, and they shoot him in the movie just because of a look in his eyes. That is definitely a crime. One last thing they failed to show is that one of the hostages was killed during the raid, as well as 2 injured. I guess that's the movie makers trying to make the SAS out to be overly competent, but given the murderous depiction, I think it's just that they didn't bother to look it up. So yeah, even though they clearly made this to glorify the British, all it does is insult them. Good job, movie. I'm pretty sure this is getting demonetized because it talks about terrorism, and that's a no-no word on YouTube, no matter how educational it is. Luckily, CuriosityStream doesn't want that content suppressed. They are a documentary streaming service with hundreds of shows to watch, some even about the history of terrorism. For instance, this series called Holy War is about some armed struggles between Islam and Christianity going back to the time of Muhammad. And its final episode is this.
9/11, 2001. Terrorists who call themselves warriors of God against the Crusaders of the West.
Pretty interesting stuff, and it actually ran on TV, so YouTube can't even get advertisers straightened out. And sadly, that's their primary job. CuriosityStream, on the other hand, has no commercials whatsoever. Just look at the amount of content they have, most of which has already ran on TV before. So if you want to check that out, and many more on a whole variety of subjects, click the link below to get a free 30-day trial. And thank you, CuriosityStream, for sponsoring this episode. Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation... Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan. Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan. Damn, almost had it. Derfla! 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 Derfla!
Yeah.